Lastly, please note that we will be recording this webinar, which will be posted online after the call. For any questions, please do send us an email at the address listed here, and we can address any questions during that time. So I'm now very pleased to introduce you to our virtual panel. Virginia Foote is joining us from the Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund. She is the Director of Fund Development at CLF Ventures, which co-sponsors the fund. Maggie Church advises on transit-oriented development finance for CLF Ventures. Adam Dolan is a member of the IRIS and Impact Measurement and Management team at the GIIN. He helps drive the integration between IRIS and other impact measurement standards. And finally, Rini Roy-Elias is the Manager of Strategic Programs and Research at the Build Healthy Places Network, where she leads measurement research and advisory services for community development and health organizations. So now I'm going to pass the mic to Rini to explain what health outcomes are relevant throughout the lens of community development. Give me one moment to unmute.
The conference has been unmuted.
I need to come back and talk to them. They actually have an impact report they're releasing tonight about Parallel 18 and the companies that are there at 6:30 that I might go check out. Yeah.
I think we're all unmuted.
Yeah. I just want to go see what it is. Yeah, I think they just put it together themselves. Yeah.
Hello, Kelly.
But yeah, I also want to introduce this to Alexandra. I'm going to talk to her. She hasn't called me today, so I kind of expect.
The conference has been muted. The conference has been muted.
All of you wouldn't mind please muting yourself. We were getting some background noise a moment there. So kindly please do mute yourself so the speakers can be heard.
The conference has been unmuted.
It isn't really the best place for us, right? Our product, yeah, exactly.
Hi,
but it's a good network to be involved in. And one thing he was talking about was
I'm really sorry.
He's a really smart guy. He's been pretty successful
in the background.
This fund that he's in the next 6 months they're going to be only $30 million, but they're doing like life science, like science tech.
The conference has been muted.
Stuff.
Everyone, again, I'm sorry. If you can please mute yourself. All you need to do so is next to your phone number or your name, please click on the green microphone button, and that will allow you to mute your line. I'm going to give you just a few seconds to do so. All right, let's try this again.
The conference has been unmuted.
All right, it seems as though most people have put themselves on mute. Rini, are you there?
This is an IRIS webcast.
All right, there's a gentleman who does not have himself on mute, who I can hear their conversation.
2004, no spaces, no capitals.
There we go. Great. Rini, take it away.
Okay. Kelly, just before I begin, I'm unable to advance my slides right now. I'm actually logged on from Colby's computer. Yeah, so if you're able to advance the slides, that would be great.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. So really excited to be here today.
Well, that shouldn't matter. You should be able to send that over your regular
network. And I think someone is still not
it shouldn't have anything to do with Wi-Fi, but that might help you.
Okay. Okay,
Okay.
I'll just keep
I'm on
moving.
another call. Love you. Bye.
Okay, so I'll just keep on moving, Kelly, if that's okay with you. So I'm going to provide a little bit of a context on the larger problem that the Metrics for Healthy Communities tool and also the Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund are trying to address and where the investable opportunities are as a result. So at the network, we often like to say that health is not equal to health care. So what we mean by that is that in 2015, the U.S. actually spent $3.2 trillion on healthcare, but 93% of that was actually spent on clinical care specifically, and 80% of actually what leads to poor health are the social and economic factors, physical environments, and health behaviors, which are all products of where one lives and the opportunity one has as a result. So really, even though we spend so much money on healthcare, it accounts for just a fraction of what contributes to health. Next slide. So addressing social determinants of health is critical because of its far-reaching impacts on preventable diseases. So this includes diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and all of these diseases actually account for $2.74 trillion, or 86% of those total healthcare costs that I just mentioned. And it's worth noting that more than half of these preventable chronic conditions affect individuals and families living specifically in low-income communities. And separately, the U.S. spends $1.24 trillion annually as a result of health inequalities. So this includes medical costs because of a sicker, more disadvantaged population, and the indirect costs from poor health, such as lost productivity, lost wages, absenteeism. And these costs represent a significant burden on society and are a substantial economic loss for the country. Next slide. So this is why it's critical to address the social determinants of health, what we at the network kind of define as the underlying conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. And this is where there is an investable opportunity to improve health. So this includes ensuring that all communities, particularly the low to moderate income communities in most need, not only have access to good health care, but also quality schools, stable housing, consistent employment, healthy foods, reliable transportation, and public safety. And so really what we're getting at here is that health is actually more broadly defined as, in terms of social determinants of health. And this is very much in line with, for example, the World Health Organization's definition of health, which is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Next slide. So these place-based determinants play out in maps such as this one, proving that zip code is more important than genetic code when it comes to your health. So this is a map of the Twin Cities, which coincidentally has consistently ranked #1 as the fittest, healthiest city in the nation by the American College of Sports Medicine in the last 5 years. Yet you'll see here that there is actually up to a 13-year difference in life expectancy among babies just born 3 miles apart. And so what you're seeing here is actually not an isolated case. There's similarly stark differences in life expectancy across neighborhoods in most cities in the U.S. And this is actually just one of many maps that the Virginia Commonwealth University's Center on Society and Health put together, where they've looked at similar conditions in cities across the U.S. Next slide. And this is why we at the network like to think of community investment as an action arm for improving health by creating economic mobility and addressing health equity as a result. And so here, when we talk about community investment, we refer to the Center for Community Investments definition, which is financial investments intended to achieve social and environmental benefits in underserved places where conventional market activity does not fully meet community needs. So Metrics for Healthy Communities, which I'm going to talk about later, provides a framework for thinking through community investments. But for now, I'll hand it back over to Kelly. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rini. That was a very helpful background. So now I'm going to turn it over to Adam to walk us through IRIS. Adam? You should be unmuted, Adam. Adam, you are unmuted, so please go ahead. While Adam is getting his microphone adjusted, I can begin to walk us through on his behalf. So just to provide a bit of a background on IRIS, for those who are less familiar, IRIS is a generally accepted catalog of metrics designed to be used by impact investors. It was created to address fragmentation in the market around terms and metrics used for reporting social and environmental performance, a challenge that at its inception was seen as a systemic constraint to the efficient and confident transfer of capital to impactful organizations because of an inability to understand the full value of impact investments. So what does a catalog of generally accepted metrics that organizations use to measure and manage their performance look like? The catalog is made up of metrics with standardized terms and definitions. Most metrics contain usage guidance that provides additional help in implementing the metric. A good example of the types of metrics IRIS has is around clients. Many investors care about understanding how many clients their investee organizations are reaching, but different organizations capture clients in different ways. If two organizations are going into an investment together and they both care about reaching clients, they want to be on the same page when they're talking about clients and be sure that they're talking about clients in a comparable way. By using IRIS, when I'm talking about client individuals and you're talking about client individuals, we can use the same definition and talk about them in the same way. A few other notes. IRIS you can think about it as a language. It doesn't tell you what to measure. Instead, it's basically a menu of options where users can pick and choose the mix that matter to them. IRIS also does not place judgment on performance, so it does not say what is good, better, or best, but it does provide a standardized way to measure performance. I also want to share that so the GIIN produces a survey of impact investors every year, an annual survey, and according to our most recent survey, IRIS continues to be ranked as the most widely used impact performance metrics catalog in the market. So the most recent statistics that have come in which 209 impact investors participated, 119 of those reported specifically measuring their social and environmental performance through IRIS-aligned metrics. And many additional reported using IRIS in conjunction with their own proprietary framework. In terms of who are the typical users, this is just a sampling just to give you a sense. IRIS can be used by an investor at no cost. It's a public good. We offer this as a public good. And because IRIS integrates with so many other leading standards, the full universe of IRIS users is much broader than what we can capture. We do have an online repository where organizations can voluntarily register their use of IRIS. User registry is nearly 200 organizations deep, including many investors focused on housing and health, who in turn require the use of IRIS from their investees to the tune of over 6,000 companies and counting. Lastly, I'd like to just spend a moment here focusing on the value of investors of aligning different measurement standards. Our team often talks about the alphabet soup of measurement tools and practices. There are so many initiatives out there to keep track of, and it can get relatively confusing to sort them out. And of course, IRIS adds to that alphabet soup a bit. But we do seek to play an important role in terms of pulling from and linking to other standards. So the approach really shows how IRIS aligns to the variety of different impact measurement management approaches that exist. We are currently, just to give those data folks in the audience a number, IRIS currently pulls from or links to over 45 of such standards. In developing the catalog, we did not seek, of course, to reinvent the wheel. Instead, we leverage existing standards when and where possible and when developing metrics. For example, the GHG metrics are pulled from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is developed by the World Resources Institute. and we've done the same approach with many others. The linkage approach also is helpful because it allows IRIS to align to other standards to create clarity about where concepts overlap and create basically a common thread in the many standards that are out there. The ability to be this common thread is a distinguishing factor of IRIS. Because of this common thread, investors can use IRIS as the basis for their impact measurement, transparency, and accountability efforts. This way, investors that follow the guidance offered by one of the me-aligned tools, like Metrics for Healthy Communities, no longer have to spend their own resources to guess which metrics to use alongside or in addition to that tool. They can have confidence that this work has been done for them through the partnership and groundwork that our shared organizations have put into this. Adam, do we have you on the line yet?
Hi, Kelly. Yep, sorry about that technical issue that we had.
Great. So why don't I turn it over to you to talk about the linkage between IRIS and MA specifically.
Great, and thanks for giving that great overview on the IRIS catalog. So as Kelly previously mentioned, there are many mechanisms through which investors can measure social and environmental performance information. IRIS and the Metrics for Healthy Communities are two of many options. IRIS and Rini's team and the two of us have been working together to create guidance that creates clarity in how IRIS and the Metrics for Healthy Communities can be used together. On the IRIS website, there's currently a 2-page document previewed on this slide, which explains conceptually how the two standards are linked and the specifics that underpin the linkage. Following this webinar, we'll share where this information can be found. For investors, these guidance materials explain how investors can use this linkage to aggregate and compare standardized performance information across their diverse portfolios. For reporting organizations such as community facilities, this linkage helps ease their reporting burden as they can use the same data points in their report on both IRIS metrics and the indicators in the Metrics for Healthy Communities. With that, I'll pass the floor back to Rini, who will provide helpful background on the Metrics for Healthy Communities.
Great, thank you. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, perfect, Rini. Thank you.
Great, and I will need help advancing the slides again. Thank you. So our job at the Build Healthy Places Network is to deepen the impacts of community investments on health equity and economic mobility, like I talked about, but specifically by catalyzing and supporting collaboration across the community development and health sectors. So we're actually a program of the Public Health Institute. We're supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and we build upon the work of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, which led early efforts to connect community development financial institutions and health leaders as part of its Healthy Communities Initiative. And you can read actually more about the Healthy Communities Initiative on our website, buildhealthyplaces.org. So as part of our current work, we help connect investors with the public health and healthcare sectors to find investable opportunities to address social determinants of health, like I talked about earlier. Next slide. And one of the ways we do this is by creating resources to support collaboration and resources specifically around measurement. So our flagship resource on measurement is called Measure Up. It's a microsite on our website, buildhealthyplaces.org, which synthesizes the best tools, resources, and case studies that we've found to help investors, community developers, and health practitioners to measure the health value of community investments. Next slide. Metrics for Healthy Communities is actually one of the featured tools on our Measure Up site, and it was an online tool developed by Wilder Research and the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis in partnership with the Build Healthy Places Network. So to be clear, the network actually serves as the user interface of the tool and the host of the tool. Wilder Research and the Minneapolis Fed are kind of the managers of the tool itself, and they regularly update the site. Next slide. The cornerstone of the Metrics for Healthy Communities tool is actually a series of logic models which provide a roadmap for thinking through different social determinants of health, like I talked about earlier, from interventions to impact. And on the site, on the tool itself, there are 6 particular social determinant domains that are focused on, and this includes affordable housing, child care centers, community health centers, fresh food access, fresh produce access, physical activity, and supportive housing. Next slide. And we see logic models as being a tool for investors in that it helps investors connect inputs, so the resources that go into a program, to activities and then to those outputs. And those are the results of those activities. These outputs can then be connected to various short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes. And you'll see here that the outcomes really capture this broad definition of health that I talked about earlier. So put another way, logic models can help investors think through certain targets as part of an investment management strategy. So, for example, if you're an investor interested in affordable housing, you may choose a particular affordable housing investment also because it offers an investable opportunity to not just provide affordable housing, but to also increase school attendance, for example, increase physical activity. So basically, an investor can look at this logic model and really break down the long-term health impacts, again capturing this broad definition of health that I talked about earlier. And health really becomes this umbrella that helps to connect different outcomes to the particular type of investment. So one thing worth noting about this tool is that there's evidence behind all of the metrics that you see here. So there are actually links to data and evidence to support the connections between all of these metrics and the interventions themselves. Next slide. So to summarize, logic models provide a framework for health investments. So they help connect investments to specific outcomes. They help investors see the connections between place-based investments and health. It facilitates shared metrics for cross-sector collaboration. And logic models finally enable more community investments, we hope, that achieve economic mobility and health equity. And it's worth mentioning as well that for investors with a preference for health impacts, logic models allow them to make more targeted investments and unlock latent capital, which, for example, hospitals and healthcare systems tend to have in a reserve. So logic models provide, we think, a viable pathway to align this capital more squarely with the investable opportunities that come with addressing social determinants. So with that, I will hand it back over to Adam to drill down into a specific example.
Thanks, Rini. So with that helpful background that Rini just provided, I wanted to dive a little more into specifically what this linkage looks like in practice. So we'll walk through a quick example. The IRIS metric on the top of this slide, land directly controlled, cultivated, aligns with the metrics for healthy community metric, number of community garden plots. This MHC metric can also be found in the physical activity logic model indicator and is organized in the logic model as an output or processes and practices that an organization can directly measure. On the outcomes side of things, student test pass rate in the IRIS catalog, for example, aligns to the academic proficiency scores indicator in the metrics for healthy communities. As you can see, while the language in both of these metrics are not 100% matched, the concepts are similar, and the data that goes into calculating one metric can be useful with responding to the other indicator, especially over time in the instance of the student test pass rate example. Out of 277 total metrics in the MHC, 123 or 44% align with IRIS. The non-alignments occurred typically because IRIS does not account for the range of outcomes that MHC does with its logic models. The way investors can think of this linkage is, if you're an investor primarily using IRIS metrics today, you can use the information you collect in order to accelerate your adopting of the MHC. Conversely, if you're an investor primarily interested in using the metrics for healthy communities, you can check out whether the indicators you've selected are aligned to IRIS metrics, which can therefore help you report to additional audiences. And with that, we'll kick it back to Kelly, who will introduce our investors.
Great, thanks, Adam. And in the meantime, I do have an ask of one of our next co-presenters. If you could please send your 2 phone numbers to Adam for whatever reason, we're having challenges with you being promoted to co-presenters. So if you can do that, then we can make sure that happens. In the meantime, before transitioning, I do want to offer sort of a quick synopsis of what we've heard and then explain what will happen next. IRIS provides a catalog of courses, as we've just talked about, or a standardized collection of the most generally accepted metrics, including those developed through MHC. MHC features logic models to help community development and health practitioners plan and evaluate projects such as affordable housing, child care centers, and clinics. Provides impact investors with a starting point for measuring and communicating the performance of their community investment portfolios and how they intersect with health. Now that we've learned a little bit about IRIS and metrics for healthy communities, let's dig into a case example to bring the approaches we've discussed to life. So CLF Ventures is an organization which works on market-oriented strategies to help solve environmental and related public health issues. As part of their work, they have launched an impact private equity fund in the community investing space, which integrates its investment and reporting work with an innovative metrics framework used on community health. As practitioners, they can provide an interesting perspective on the power of metrics. CLF's work captures the spirit of IRIS and the MHC logic models through its health score rating system, which, like MHC, helps investors target new investments based on both financial returns and a particular set of economic, environmental, and health impacts. So what you will hear next is an investor-specific example of how such an approach can guide investment specifically for equitable, transit-oriented development projects in Massachusetts. So without further ado, we have two panelists from CLF Ventures who will briefly describe their fund and metrics framework. We have Virginia Foote, Director of Fund Development at CLF Ventures, will kick off, followed by Maggie Superchurch, Senior Advisory to CLF Ventures. Give me one moment to make sure. Virginia, are you able to? Can we hear you? Just make sure here. Virginia, I have you unmuted, so please, if you have yourself muted.
This is Virginia. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Great. Wonderful.
So thanks, Kelly. I'm Virginia Foote and Direct Fund Development at CLF Ventures. We work on market-oriented strategies to help solve environmental and related public health issues. As Kelly mentioned, we integrate work in impact investing, metrics, and research. And this three-part strategy creates a strong feedback loop which allows us to build, learn, and share, all in the name of strengthening and deepening environmental and community health impacts. I want to give some context for the attendees today to ground the metrics and framework approach, which we will discuss in a few minutes, and just talk a little bit about the fund that we have launched. It's called the Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund, and it's an impact private equity fund that invests in transit-oriented development real estate projects across Massachusetts in transitional neighborhoods, with a vision to improve community health trends through intentional investments in the built environment. The geographies we target typically have significant health disparities from state averages. The fund is a pilot fund which provides patient equity at slightly lower cost to help fill a funding gap which frequently makes it very difficult to finance mixed use, mixed income, transit-oriented development investments in our target communities. And while it is a pilot fund, along with some of our investors, including two national foundations, we really think the model can be replicated in certain markets across the country. The Healthy Neighborhood Equity Fund invests for both health outcomes as well as triple bottom line returns, financial, environmental, and social. And the projects in which we invest are typically built in multiple phases, and our capital helps finance the construction of the market rate housing, retail, and commercial spaces, and the phases that those pieces are under which they're constructed. The housing is additive to the community. In other words, it's new housing, it's not rehabilitation, and is typically priced between 80 to 120 of area median income. As I'm sure many listening in here know, we have found partnerships to be critical in tackling the complex issues of housing, health, and equity. And this is certainly true for our work, both on the investment side and for our metrics. We co-sponsored this fund with a regional community development finance institution called the Massachusetts Housing Investment Corporation, which has many years of experience underwriting real estate investments in our target communities. And we've developed an innovative metrics framework, which we're going to hear about soon, to marry with this investment strategy. For more fund information, you can go to hnefund.org. Hopefully this provides enough context for the metrics framework used by the fund. You'll hear from me again a bit later, but now I want to hand the floor over to Maggie Superchurch, who is a senior advisor to CLF Adventures. She has been involved from the beginning conceptual formation of the Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund, is a member of the investment committee, and is the creative brain behind the innovative framework and metrics approach used by the fund. Maggie, over to you.
Maggie,
Thank you.
Perfect.
Can you hear me there, Kelly? Kelly?
Yep, you are live.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks so much, Jenna. If we could go to the next slide. Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we developed our metrics for the Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund. I will start by saying when we undertook this effort about 5 years ago, our organizations had a lot of experience with real estate development and investment and had thought a lot about traditional so-called triple bottom line metrics for community and environmental benefit. We were really interested in health impact but had less expertise and experience in-house, and so we approached a number of partners in Massachusetts to help us think about how we would structure the fund and the metrics for both screening and monitoring impact in the projects that the fund supports. We're very fortunate to have a terrific State Department of Public Health as well as a regional planning agency with deep expertise in data as well as expertise in public health. So we worked closely with those partners to commission what's called a health impact assessment, which is a tool that's widely used to look at the potential health benefits or potentially harm created by a policy or a project. It might be local, it might be statewide, and it allowed us to take a deep dive on this question about how an impact investing fund like ours could begin to think about health benefits supported by the projects we invest in. And that health impact assessment, which is available online, and we can certainly provide a link to that, provided a foundation and a framework for us to understand the links between changes in built environment at the neighborhood scale and changes in population health, covering many of the areas that Rini spoke about earlier. That in turn allowed us to develop a scorecard that we use to both screen neighborhoods for potential investment as well as specific projects that are seeking funds in the way that Jenna described earlier. Next slide, please. So the health impact assessment covered a lot of territory and had a number of parts to it, including a pretty intensive review of the literature on the connection between health and environment. And part of what the health impact assessment does is look at all the evidence in the literature as well as how people understand and experience policies and practices in place, and think about how we might project impact from those policies or projects into the future. And one of the most important outcomes of our health impact assessment was the table you see on this slide here, which looked at a variety of so-called health determinants, and these are really factors or elements of the built environment, and particularly elements of the kinds of projects we're investing in that are a mix of housing and commercial space, oftentimes public improvements and infrastructure close to transit, and then linking those determinants or those elements to very specific health outcomes and understanding the likelihood that those outcomes may occur in a particular place, as well as the total breadth of impact. So how many people might be impacted, how deep is that impact, and how likely is that impact? When you consider all of those factors together, you end up with the chart that you see here. What's interesting to us about this is that much of the work on impact of the built environment around things like housing has focused at the level of an individual housing unit, which obviously has tremendous impact on the family in that unit. But when you begin to think about all of the various ways that development impacts everyone in a neighborhood, whether you live there, work there, walk by, visit the retail, or have some other form of interaction, you begin to see a different way of thinking about how those factors relate to health outcomes. And so at the top, walkability and active transport turn out to be one of the most important ways to drive better health in neighborhoods. It's linked to physical activity, to mental health, to chronic disease, and in turn relates to things like safety. As you have more people walking around, putting eyes on the street, neighbors begin to know each other, places become safer. Clearly, all of these factors are hugely important, but it began to help us understand the ways in which all these factors interact and how we might think about them in the context of structuring our fund. Next slide, please. So we took that foundational document, that health impact assessment, as well as due diligence we did around some of the broader environmental and community benefits, and created a scorecard that we call the health score that, as I mentioned earlier, includes both a neighborhood screen and a project screen. On the neighborhood screen, before we even look at a project, we are assessing fundamentally 4 things using a variety of qualitative and quantitative metrics. The first, and we want to emphasize one of the most important, is the level of community support for development, and particularly development of the kind that our fund is investing in. We are hoping and working to ensure that our investments are not one-off projects, but that they are part of a larger vision and plan supported by thoughtful work in the community and by the public sector to lead toward broader community change. So that's one of the first things we look for, whether the table has been set through things like infrastructure investment, zoning, planning. We're also looking at places that have significant health disparities. So we look at the data for the neighborhood where the project is proposed to be built and compare that to our statewide average. When we see a big gap, that's a place we know that our investment could make a big difference. Similarly, under advancing regional equity, we look at broader factors like unemployment, access to transportation, other factors like household income to understand whether the projects might contribute to addressing some of those inequities in broader factors related to the region as a whole. Lastly, we look at access to multimodal transit. This is a transit-oriented development fund. For us, that means we'd like to invest in places where transit exists or is planned. That will look different, obviously, in Boston compared to other outlying cities that might have commuter rail or bus service. But the basic concept is looking at places that have the opportunity to get people out of cars and moving around in other ways and providing access to regional amenities, services, jobs, and so forth. Once we have looked at the neighborhood criteria and determined that the neighborhood itself is a good fit using the metrics that sit under the neighborhood screen, we then move on to look at the project screen. And this is really where many of the findings and recommendations of the health impact assessment help to guide our thinking. You'll note that at the top of the project screen, for example, neighborhood walkability is one of our high-level factors. We use a proprietary analytical tool called state of place to assess the current level of walkability and quality in a place and the delta or the difference that would be created when this project or this proposed project is built. We also look at housing choice and affordability, the extent to which the project will increase housing choice and affordability across a range of incomes and for a range of household types. We look at whether the project will promote community safety. We look at access to green space and recreation as well as healthy food, both in terms of what the project provides and what may already exist in the neighborhood. We look at factors that will enhance access to transit and make it easier for people to move around without cars by providing things like bicycle storage inside, by ensuring that people can safely get from their unit to transit if those connections are easy and well built. We look at the extent to which the project is likely to have some type of transformative impact based on the site, the location, the current condition of the site. So for example, transforming a blighted, contaminated site is likely to have a more transformative impact than a site that's already built and active. We look at economic opportunity through local job creation as well as access to regional jobs and the quality of those jobs locally. We look at indoor air quality using the EPA Indoor Air Plus specifications as a good proxy for factors that drive health. And we look at building and site performance with respect to environmental concerns such as stormwater management, taking care of urban heat islands through increasing tree canopy, energy conservation, renewable energy generation, and so forth. So together, all of those factors, many of which can be measured quantitatively, some of which must be assessed qualitatively, stack up to a score, which we then use to rate a project for investment. Next slide, please. So I want to say a little bit about how we use the data, because one of the important points here is not that it's just counting widgets to count widgets, but really thinking about how data and metrics allow investors to make better decisions and allow project sponsors to achieve the greatest impact that they can. So to begin with, every investment that we consider has to meet both the underwriting criteria as well as our health score review. And that's important to know because a project can't advance to committee without having passed both of those tests. As I mentioned earlier, every project has both a neighborhood score and a project score that are together weighted to create an overall score. That score is then translated into a tier rating, moderate, high, or very high impact. And along with the underwriting, that goes to our investment committee for final approval. We found that this process enables us as the fund sponsors to influence the design of the project, sometimes the programming, often without significantly changing the cost structure, particularly if we can have those conversations early on. It also allows us to establish a baseline set of indicators against which we can measure progress over time on some of the things that we care about and where we hope to see change. It's also important to note that the data comes from a myriad of sources. As I mentioned earlier, we partnered with our regional planning agency and our Department of Public Health to conduct the health impact assessment. Those partners also continue to provide data for us as we screen and review projects. And also, as I mentioned, we work with an independent consultant with an assessment tool called State of Place to assess changes in neighborhood walkability. Our role at CLF Ventures is to compile that data, report it to the fund manager, to the investment committee, and to track that over time and report back to our investors. Next slide, please. So finally, to wrap up, I'll turn it back to Jenna to talk about why we think this is valuable and how we hope other investors might begin to think about a similar approach.
Thanks, Maggie. Can everybody hear me? Big picture, as Maggie described, the metrics used by the Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund do much more than measure output, which is often where the metrics conversations are focused. The metrics framework that our fund uses has been a critical tool to attract investment capital. It helped align different public sources of capital that invested in the fund, as well as attract diverse private investors from national foundations, a public health system, high net worth investors, as well as commercial banks, all of whom care deeply about the mission of the fund and the vision to improve community health through the built environment. As described by Maggie, the multidimensional metrics and screening process enable the fund to target specific issues, including important social determinants of health, as well as target specific geographies most in need of this type of impact capital. Sometimes we can use the screening process to incentivize developers to redesign and change, which can be very powerful and improve and deepen impact. Finally, the screening process creates a baseline against which we can monitor change over time in the investment and surrounding community health trends. Increasingly complex social and environmental challenges require the reframing of issues based on multidimensional levels, and our framework really attempts to do this. We see the Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund and our metrics framework very much in the spirit of the way the Build Healthy Places Network is connecting real estate development to community health through its mapping and measurement tools. And both approaches contribute to changing the frame, often separate discussions and separate strategies addressing housing, the environment, nutrition, and jobs, to one that is a more cohesive conversation and holistic solution for community health. A seismic shift in many ways and a critical one, in our opinion. Thank you. Kelly, back over to you for any concluding comments you might have in Q&A.
Great. Can you hear me? Yes. Great. Jenna, thanks so much, and thanks everyone for your contributions. We've had some really interesting questions start to roll in. First, I'm going to start, Jenna, with you. We have one. This is a great question. In response to sort of your use of impact performance data for decision making, have you done anything differently because of what you've been learning through the scorecard and through your measurement approach?
Well, as mentioned, we use our screening scorecard to screen every investment, and so before it goes to investment committee, it has to not only pass the underwriting process, which is what a typical private equity investment fund undertakes, but it also has to go through our screening process. So the neighborhood has to score on our scorecard as a community that has significant health disparities from the state averages, and that this type of community scores in a way that tells us it really needs this type of investment capital that's slightly lower cost and more patient equity. We're not in the business of financing, real estate projects in communities where it's easy to finance them in the private sector. And of course, the projects have to meet our screening criteria as well. So we won't invest in certain investments that don't meet that criteria. And there have been investments in our pipeline where we've had to either say no or to request the developer continue redesign before they can be considered for the equity. Maggie, please feel free to chime in if you have additional color you want to add.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Great, thanks. This next question is for Rini. Rini, what are some examples of health metrics in light of what we learned about sort of social determinants of health? Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of what types of metrics capture the broader definition of health?
Sure. Thank you for that question. Well, I think this really speaks to what I talked about earlier in terms of the different types of social determinants being health, being essentially this broad definition of health. And I can give you an example of a project that we've done here at the network that I think can lend some insight into how we can think about health metrics. So we did this project which we're calling a Common Indicators Project, where we looked at commonly used social determinants of health indicators across community development, healthcare, and public health tools. And really what we were trying to get at is where are kind of the areas of overlap, how are these different sectors defining health and health metrics in different ways. And what kind of emerged from this research, unsurprisingly, there wasn't overall kind of universal consensus around particular health metrics or particular proxies for health, but there was more or less consensus about high school graduation rates being one of the best proxies for kind of understanding health at the neighborhood level. So I think, high school graduation rate, some of the things that you saw in the slides where I included the logic model, from physical activity to housing stability to school attendance, all of these types of metrics point to health, and they're not traditionally what we would think about health, but they do kind of point to the overall health and well-being of a community. But that also doesn't take away the need to look at things like obesity rates or ER admissions. And thankfully, there is a new tool that was a new initiative, actually, through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation called the 500 Cities Project, which is now making neighborhood-level health data, the traditional health data that we kind of think about when we think about health. Now that is becoming available at the neighborhood level and more specifically at the census tract level. So now it is possible to look at the traditional health metrics that are commonly used in public health, as well as these kind of broader health metrics that point to the social determinants. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you very much. This next question goes back to Jenna and Maggie. And maybe sort of speaking on behalf of your fellow investors, how much investor education do you think is required when describing the impact metrics used, the performance information that's being shared, and the data that's being compiled back to those metrics? And I think, if I'm sort of digging into the nature of this question a little bit more, I think it's really digging into how do we actually understand the data that's coming out of this, the metrics that you're using, and make decisions on it.
Sure. Well, I can start on that one, and Jenna can chime in. I would say I think that different investors come in with different degrees of understanding around this. Many of our investors have a great deal of experience with community development lending and investing through, particularly for the bank's Community Reinvestment Act financing and the requirements attached to that, and are very accustomed to looking at things like the degree of low-income families in a particular census tract. So some of the data is familiar, particularly for those who have worked in community development through lending and investing, like low-income housing tax credits or new market tax credits, commercial lending, small business investing. But the connection to health outcomes is often a little bit of a head scratcher and not an obvious connection at first. The way that we often start the conversation with investors is to point out the health disparities in Boston, much like what Rini spoke about earlier. In Boston, we have, I think, the dubious distinction of having one of the largest disparities in life expectancy in nearly adjacent neighborhoods either side of the Boston Medical Center and the Longwood Medical Area. We see a 33.5-year difference in life expectancy for two neighborhoods. And that is really shocking because clearly those neighborhoods are in the same regional economy. They share many of the same assets and opportunities, and yet we see these very stark differences. And that begins to open a conversation about why it is that place is so vital in driving broader health outcomes that ultimately translate into how long and how well we live. And so I would say over the course of our work with Mass Housing Investment Corporation and our partners, I think we've all come to appreciate the depth and significance of those connections in some new ways and to be really thoughtful about how we use data to really challenge our own understandings and assumptions about what's happening and what we can do to try and change some of those disparities.
Great, thanks. And this next question goes back to Rini. So, and this one really is about socialization and buy-in. So, Rini, apart from investors, what other decision makers or influencers need to buy into and use the metrics on neighborhood projects? So, for example, if we're thinking beyond just U.S. boundaries, this particular participant notes that there are sort of many other agencies that might need to be involved. Can you just offer some tips and thoughts in terms of how you might have worked across sort of borders, if you, as it were, to kind of work on broader universal adoption of the logic models or this kind of thinking?
Sure. I think what's really nice about the Metrics for Healthy Communities framework is that I think it's applicable to a pretty wide range of stakeholders. So I think this webinar kind of captured the overlap with the IRIS metrics and the potential for investors, but the other types of stakeholders that could potentially use this and benefit from the tool include government agencies, public health departments, economic development departments, even kind of mayor's offices that happen to have a focus on community development, and kind of within the community development sphere, we tend to focus a lot on community development financial institutions, but this could potentially be a tool for a much wider range of financial institutions as well, that really maybe are in I guess the financial institutions that also may find themselves in alignment with impact investing and kind of the similar preferences of impact investors. I think another kind of set of stakeholders that we focus on is kind of on the healthcare side. Healthcare systems and hospitals already do kind of their own assessments to kind of assess the needs of the communities around them. But this could potentially be a tool to kind of help them think through what kinds of investments they may want to do in line with their broader population health goals as a hospital. So that's an area that we're kind of currently exploring, but that's just kind of a quick landscape of the types of stakeholders that can use the tool and can potentially benefit from it. And I think another kind of piece of this is that the goal of tools like this is to really facilitate cross-sector thinking and cross-sector collaboration. So it really helps to kind of move all of these different types of stakeholders towards this shared language about the metrics. So ideally, we'd love to see this tool and, similarly, the types of rating systems that Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Funds use as, a tool to kind of help bring these various stakeholders together at the same table to talk about metrics and impact.
Thanks, Rini. And this next question goes to Adam. Adam, this participant notes they understand that IRIS is a catalog of metrics, but are wondering about data. So wondering about whether or not there's a database where an organization tracking perhaps one metric can compare their results to other organizations also tracking the same IRIS metric. Adam, maybe you can say a few words about that, and I'm happy to share some thoughts as well.
Great. Yeah, it's a great question. And right now, at the moment, IRIS is just a repository for the metrics. The GIIN does not track the actual data, though we do have a resource that's called Impact Base, which is a repository of funds. So you get a little closer to what's actually going on. But Kelly, I'll let you fill in anything else.
Great. I will point you to, when you go to the IRIS website, and you can see the URL here, if you land on the resources section, we have produced several data briefs which look to sort of demonstrate how different IRIS metrics can be sort of aggregated and compared. And so this is a for demonstration purposes, but if you're interested, there are sort of 4 briefs available at the moment. But as Adam mentioned, we don't systematically track the data or performance on IRIS metrics at the moment. This is something that, of course, is definitely an open question, and would love to follow up with that particular participant on their thoughts on this matter. We have one more question. I think actually we do not have time for one more question. I'm sorry. Feel free to email us at the email address that's listed on this slide, and we're happy to answer any of your questions or make sure that your questions are addressed as well as we can. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded, and it will be available. The recording will be available for you all should you want to look at it or share it with others in your networks. Thank you all again very much, and thanks very much to the speakers today. Enjoy the rest of your day.